Hello, I'm geographer Rachael Unsworth, member of the Civic Trust for a long time. I'm an author, and a lot of the time I'm a tour guide and other things besides. And I'm interested in the past, the present, and the future of Leeds. And I try to consider it always in its wider context. Now, with this talk, it's an enormous topic. And it runs for a very long time through the history of England and this part of the world. And I always try to stress when I'm doing tours just how long this was the top industry of this part of England. I'm going to set out the stages of the process of making woolen cloth, show the effects of the technological progress, and then do a bit on the geography of the woolen cloth making in this part of England, the north, and with a particular focus on Leeds. Now, there's such a long backstory before we get to medieval times, even. And as James Bentley, in his really interesting book from the 1880s, said, the beginnings of the textile arts lie hidden in the impenetrable mists of prehistoric time. So there was a very long period when mainly cloth was being made as a subsistence kind of activity and for perhaps local trading at most. And then eventually it became national and then international. But in this country, by the 12th century, wool was the top export. And now when I do tours, I ask people, are you wearing any wool by any chance? And certainly in the summer, nobody says yes. And sometimes in the winter, there is still somebody wearing something made of wool. But it's hard for people to realize just how huge this was. Now, we're going to break down the very complex series of processes that fall into, I think, five main categories. And this is the listing. Bewildering series of processes with some very odd vocabulary. I'm not going to deal with it all in detail, but give you a bit more of an idea of what all these things were about and what the words mean. So the words evolved over time as well, and new ones popped up to describe novel processes and products. And there are some ambiguities because terms coexisted, they were used differently in different parts of the country, and yet there's a constancy too. So the crucial improvements that made a difference in medieval times, the spinning wheel, broad looms, wider, and the fulling mills, I'll explain that. These were already in place by the 14th century. So long stability between the 14th century and then the industrialization of this industry from the 18th century onwards. Now, I'm not a historian, I've said I'm a geographer, and I've not been back to primary sources. But these are just some of the sources that can be used by historians, and John Lee and other scholars have combed the patchy and inadequate records relating to wool and cloth. And few of these records were deliberately created with a view to future historians using them. And by the way, I did use AI. I asked a question, what are the main types of sources for studying the history of the English wool and woolen cloth industries? And it threw up some short paragraphs from which I created this list, which I think was quite useful. As long as you use it discriminatingly, you can get some use out of AI. Now, the sheep. Well, spinning and weaving is thought to have developed around 1900 BC in this country, using fibre from some animal that we wouldn't probably recognize very easily now. But the native sheep was descended from a small breed similar to a Soay sheep, developed from the wild sheep of Northern Europe. And Britons had established a wool industry well before the Romans arrived in 55 BC, and they brought with them larger sheep with finer white wool. And by the 3rd century, there was a hard-wearing British wool cloth that was well thought of and was exported widely. And it was made of fibre spun so fine that it's in a manner comparable to the spider's web. And the Vikings brought their own breeds of black-faced horned sheep, the ancestors of today's blackface and Swaledale and Herdwick, well-known breeds. And then into the 17th century, the white-faced woodland was developed and became very common in the West Riding, our part of Yorkshire. The reorganisation of the local authority areas 50 years ago meant that we no longer have that term West Riding, but for studying the history, you have to know where that was. So then the merino sheep that had been developed by the Spanish. They eventually let other people in on their secret of producing this fine wool. And the merino was bred in Germany and more widely, and then taken to Australia, from where the wool was then imported back here. Now, going back to medieval times, there were various edicts to try to protect and improve the woolen industry here. So under Henry III, and then in the next century, Edward III. And with this crucial move in the 14th century to invite Flemish weavers here. And now they settled in various parts of England, including East Yorkshire and in York, and the techniques gradually spread westwards. And then there were more migrants from the Netherlands and Flanders, and a great trade arose between this country and the Low Countries. And that trade doubled between 1475 and 1550. Now, Steve Burt, local historian here in Leeds, is exploring the way that two-way trade evolved and what came back here in exchange for the cloth that was going from England to mainland Europe. So look out for work coming forward on that, and a Thoresby paper no doubt will ensue. And here is a 19th century depiction of how the Flemish weaving scene might have looked from a famous set of murals in Manchester Town Hall. Now, going back to the medieval period itself, Kirkstall Abbey, amongst several major abbeys across the north of England, controlled a huge amount of territory during 400 years from the mid-12th century. And they had massive flocks, and fleeces were sent to Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. And it wasn't until later that weaving for export really started up, following that 14th century move by Edward III. Now, if we just look at after centuries of gradual growth under Cistercians, let's just look at the map here and focus in on our bit of Yorkshire, which, by the way, is shown here in the 16th century with the rivers, the hills, wooded areas, other features, small settlements, larger ones, including Leeds right here. No roads, you'll notice. And the picture really was that the woolen cloth industry was using very similar tools and techniques all the way through from the Kirkstall era to the 16th century. And we have indications from materials such as the will of Leeds' own John Pawson in 1576. That there were no implements in use at the time of this map, the same as John Pawson's will date, that were redundant 200 years later. So all the same things were being used in the 18th century, in other words, as had been used by John Pawson and his fellow cloth makers and finishers. That's a fact that comes from Crump, W.B. Crump in 1931. Now, the woolen cloth industry then was dominant from the 12th century to the 19th century. And here's a quote that Parliament declared that no other industry had been so widespread and had persisted at such a high level of prosperity for so long. In the 17th century, we see another quote here that Leeds and the surrounding area had become stronger after the Kirkstall era. And wool was being brought in from Lincolnshire and from Leicestershire, as well as being grown here in Yorkshire. And there were strong exports by the 17th century. But there were still improvements to come. And during the 17th century, we're focusing on this year because it's 400 years since we got the charter that helped to consolidate trading power for the merchants here. There were, though, difficulties and trade competition, and it's, as John Cruikshank said in his Thoresby lecture just a few days ago in March 2026, that it's a complicated story about who was doing what and where the power lay. Now, we're going to just summarize this picture of the growth rates going forward from the 18th century. And you can see that it varied and it depended on all sorts of factors, which we won't go into here. But you can see that as mechanization took hold from the late 18th century, the pace of production increased substantially. And then it really peaked by the late 19th century. And after the First World War, because of competition from other places and because other industries were in the ascendant and because of new fabrics and so on, it never recovered and was on a downward trajectory from then onwards. Now, a new section where we go back through these various different processes, and you can see the way that the different elements of the woolen cloth industry was built up from these different parts of the process. So there were perhaps 12 different qualities of wool on any one fleece, and so these all had to be carefully sorted. Weights could be fraudulently increased by inclusion of extra items, and those had to be sifted out. And then the wool was washed in baskets in a stream, and here in Yorkshire we had good soft water for washing the wool. And it was important to get rid of the natural fat, the lanolin, which also was mixed up with trapped dirt and debris and dried sweat. Yes, sheep do sweat. That all made the wool sticky and difficult and unpleasant to handle. And so scouring removes the heavy grease buildup that can also impede the dyeing process, stop the dye taking so well. And it clogged up equipment and created uneven yarn. And then seeds caught in the fleeces and other rubbish had to be picked out by hand. And then came the willying of the wool. Now we're supposed to be able to move on here. I'm not quite sure what. There we are. Then came the willying of the dried wool. You can see where that word is derived from, and the final picking over. And then you can see there was scope for improved techniques here, a rather primitive method of spinning the water off the wool. Now, to prepare the wool for the spinning process, there's still more to do before you actually get to spinning. And it depended on which fibres you were working with. For the short fibres, the technique was carding, these bats with metal pins. And for the longer fibres, this careful process of combing. You're trying to align the fibres and create a sort of loose skein of wool that will then be passed to the spinners. Now, these were whether you use short fibers, long fibers, a mix of one for the one part of the thread or the warp or for the weft. You can make all sorts of different kinds of fabric, depending on how finely it was spun and so on and so forth. Just listen to this recital of some of the different kinds of cloth that could be made, all from wool. Sagathis, Duroy, Estamaines, Shalloons, Poplins, Lustings, Calimanco, Bombazine, Stuff Damask, Camblets, Crepes, Russells, Druggets, Sanfords and Bays, Swansdowns and Toilenettes. It's quite poetic, isn't it? Now, after these hand processes came a hand carding machine, so it improved the efficiency. And then the development of a more sophisticated machinery that helped to speed up the process, all run by water mills before we got to the steam processes. Here's the spinning process, and a little poem here. From the 1st century BC, the loaded distaff in the left hand placed, with spongy coils of snow-white wool was graced. From these the right hand lengthening fibres drew, which into thread 'neath nimble fingers grew. So you could pull out or draw the thread to create a finer yarn. The more you pulled it out, the finer the yarn that you resulted. So more twist gave it a different finish, and the spinning wheel was used in England from the 14th century, and that doubled the output of a spinner. That's in the estimation of Adam Smith, whose famous book on economics came out 250 years ago this month. But you couldn't even keep up with the weavers when you improved a spinning wheel with a foot treadle like this. The spinners needed to have some greater efficiency in order to keep up with the weavers. So James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny way back in the 18th century, and that enabled 16 threads to be drawn out at once. And lots of women and children were involved in this. Next came the water frame, invented by Richard Arkwright, and this could be driven by a water wheel. Here's what it looked like. When it came to be driven by steam, it was called a throstle. And the spinning mule was another move towards improving efficiency. Poor old Crompton didn't do very well out of it. Other people stole his ideas and he didn't have them protected well. So you can see that far fewer people were needed to produce many, many separate lines of yarn there. Now we can still see the machines in Armley Mills in the display there. Finally, we come to weaving. Must have been hot work. Here's a man with a rather narrow piece of cloth being produced with his shuttle going back and forth. Here's a broader loom and a slightly more modern picture, making a typical piece of broadcloth which was about 30 yards long. That's a bit less than 30 meters. And this was the pattern. So the warp went up and down the loom, very long threads set up on the loom, and then the weaving was to make the other yarn go back and forth between the shed created by these alternate sets of thread going up and down as the shuttle went across. So you can remember the weft goes from right to left, is the way I remember it. And here are some examples of worsted, which is very fine woolen cloth made out of the longer fibres and particularly carefully finished. And this one, by the way, doesn't go through the fulling process. It's the more coarser sorts of cloth that go through fulling, which we're coming to in a moment. This is again showing different patterns of weaving depending on how you set up the loom to create the raising and lowering of the warp threads so that the weft can go back and forth. Now, one of the very important weaving innovations was the flying shuttle, and that was so that the one person could cope with a loom instead of there having to be two people for each loom. So there was a mechanism that threw the shuttle back and forth. Now, this was invented pretty early on, before those improvements in spinning. So it meant that the weavers were being more productive, and they were still waiting for the crucial breakthrough, as I would think it should be, in spinning to provide them with enough yarn to keep their looms working. Now, the growth in cloth output is very clearly shown on this graph. And you can see here that the increase in amount produced was largely because of the vast expansion in the amount of broadcloth being made from the late 18th century into the 19th century. Edmund Cartwright's power loom was pioneered back in the 1780s, but it was a long time before this was widely adopted. It came into the cotton industry first, but even in that branch of textiles, it wasn't fully adopted until well into the 19th century. And for wool, it took much longer to find a way to deal with this much more tricky fibre so that it didn't break or stretch too far in the machine. So it had to come out with a softer finish, and that took much more skill in creating the weaving process. So but it was obviously it was an advantage to have power looms because whereas before each piece was produced just by one person and took much longer. Now you could have a much greater output. A hand loom weaver in 1836 seldom produced more than 30 or 40 yards of cloth per week, minding two. Well, no, sorry, I'll start again. A hand loom weaver in 1836 seldom produced more than 30 or 40 yards of cloth per week. Now, a single weaver minding two looms will frequently turn out 200 or 250 yards of cloth in the same time. And that was in a 19th century account. But as a slow progress in the take-up of this machinery. And Edward Baines of Leeds, who was the newspaper owner of the Leeds Mercury and later became MP and was a chronicler of the cloth industry, estimated that there were only just over 12,000 power looms in England by 1820, and then more rapid take-up until by 1833 he estimated 85,000 power looms, but by the way, mostly in the cotton industry. Worsted first used this technology not in 1830 because it was particularly difficult to produce that kind of fine cloth with power looms. But by 1835, Yorkshire had nearly 3,000 power looms, and this was growing apace, so that by the middle of the century, power looms were starting to dominate. But you'll see, therefore, that the hand loom weaving carried on alongside power loom weaving, and there was an increased need for hand loom weavers because by now the spinning machines were turning out so much yarn that the weavers couldn't keep up with the spinners. So not everything happened at the right pace and in the right order. Now we come to, oh yes, here's another picture showing a whole great mill full of the power being uh, passed to a whole series of looms. Now we come to fulling, from Latin, meaning to walk or trample on the cloth in a pit of urine and water. Charming. And then after that, it was washed again. And until the development of the fulling mill with the hammers to pummel the cloth in water, that was how it was done. And the reason was that it was to clean and thicken it to make it more sort of matted, though remember, this didn't apply to worsted, and the surface texture changed. And it became more waterproof and warmer and less likely to fray when it was cut. I haven't labelled this picture immediately, but those of you who are local will no doubt realise that this is Armley Mills. And this rather lovely little verse. Next, from the slackened beam the woof unrolled, near some clear sliding river, air all stroud, is by the noisy fulling mill received, where tumbling waters turn enormous wheels, and hammers rising and descending learn to imitate the industry of man. So this is when it's a water-driven process, the tumbling waters, turning the great wheel, and the hammers imitating the walkers, the tuckers, another name for the people who did this job. And this fuller's earth could be applied instead of urine, and that was to absorb the lanolin and other oil or grease impurities. And it was a naturally occurring clay that was found in the West Country. And so downstream, mills were developed as well, but where the water wasn't so tumbling. But the mills were often used for other purposes. So here in Leeds, the King's Mill, as it had been called, was used for corn grinding and other purposes as well as for fulling. The very first fulling mill in this part of the world was from the 12th century down at Temple Newsam. And the first known mill actually had been in Normandy in the 11th century. They became widespread from the 13th century onwards, and by 1750 there were more than 100 fulling mills in the West Riding of Yorkshire by the middle of the 18th century. Now, after the fulling came the stretching out of the cloth to dry. This is part of the Cousins map of 300 years ago. And this shows us one of three patches on that map of the tenter grounds where wooden frames were set up and the cloth was stretched across the frames on hooks and tightly drawn, but not too tightly. People got into trouble for stretching the cloth too much so that it would measure the standard amount, but it reduced the quality if it was stretched too much. So it had to be very well judged. But on these tenter frames, on the hooks, hence tenter hooks, we can also see on this map the dyer's garth. And here's the Buck Prospect showing another form of tenter ground. Dyers. Well, for centuries, using natural dyes, it depended on the concentration and the time in the dye and the number of passes through the dyes to the intensity that you got. And here is an experiment that's been catalogued by Isabella Whitworth, who's been experimenting with all these natural dyes. And she's going to give a talk about one particular specialist dye, and you'll be able to see this. I hope the talk can be on our website of the Phil and Lit after the event in April this year. So if you'd like to book for it, you can go through, but you'll be able to see it afterwards as well. After the dyeing come various stages of cloth finishing, really intricate, different processes involved. There's the sequence, and then these are the tools of the trade, including the great shears for cutting the surface of the cloth after the raising of the nap with the teasels. So Here is an old illustration of this chap with his kind of a bat filled with these teasels, which is like the hooky side of Velcro. And they never really found anything else that was quite as good as the teasel, though there was a special kind of teasel that was developed that had straighter sides so that it could be very effectively loaded into drums on a machine, and then the cloth was dragged past the drum to raise the fine fibres to create a special surface to the cloth. So extraordinary that it was still this natural product that was then put into a machine. And there is a book called Teasels and Teaselmen, which tells the story of the important trade in growing and transporting to Leeds and dealing in teasels. Then came the cropping with these great big shears, and presumably it was the strongest young men who were specialists, as shown here in this picture from the famous Walker book of 1814, which is purportedly about the costumes of Yorkshire, but historians have tended to draw on it very much for the scenes that it depicts. What are the people doing? Where are they and what are they doing? The clothes are not always as interesting as that. So here we've got the hand process of cropping, but this was one of the processes that was quite early subjected to mechanization, and it displaced a lot of the workforce. And it was these processes of teaseling and cropping which gave rise to a lot of unrest in the early industrial period. It wasn't as bad here in Leeds as in some other places, but it was definitely a difficult process to bring in machinery that seemed to be doing people out of jobs. This is the result of a finished piece of cloth, showing a twill weave. And here, zooming in more closely. Excuse me. And now we can just rehearse via a 15th century stained glass window from France, which gives us a wonderful, colourful record of some of the processes. Here we see them doing the picking of the wool of the fleece, and then carding, the drawing, weaving, fulling, teaseling, shearing, and the brushing. And here from Lipson's useful book of 1921, the various stages of cloth making. And we can draw attention also to the names in England that derive from these various stages of cloth making. So we have from fulling, Fuller, Walker, and Tucker. And it so happens that the two geography teachers at my school in Beverley, a famous centre of medieval cloth making, but our geography teachers were called Miss Walker and Mr. Tucker. Then from dyeing, we have Dyer, of course, and Dexter and Lister. And then, as well as Weaver, we have the names Webb, Webster, and Sherman. And then a parmenter means a tailor, as well as the name tailor itself, and many more besides that are linked. And then the vocabulary of cloth making is threaded through our language as well. So let's just do the summary of the inventions in the 18th century. And the weaving is portrayed in that dark red, and the others are the spinning innovations. And I say, not everything happened in the right order and in a timely way. But, and then just to revise that whole series of processes, and when you go back to look at the recording, of course, you can dwell on this for longer and look more things up if you like. And going back to good old W.B. Crump, Just to summarize here, the master clothier, the handloom weaver, and the cropper, with unchanged tools and methods, remained important figures in the industry, not only to 1820, but beyond it. Parallel with them, the new manufacturer, the factory owner, was steadily making breaches in the domestic system, but he made little progress in disturbing the traditional processes or in introducing new machinery. I just should have explained en passant the meaning of the word clothier, which is tricky, and John Cruikshank drew attention to this when he gave his March Thoresby talk, that it can just refer to somebody who was a weaver who sold his cloth in the market, but increasingly it came to mean a weaver who had several families producing cloth, and he oversaw the whole process. He might be the one who delivered wool to them and then gathered in the cloth and took it to market. And so there was a kind of preparatory exercise for scaling up into actual factories, and that's what we go on to now. So the major industries of the 19th century are depicted here in the Penguin Atlas of British and Irish History. And let's just focus in on this bit of Northern England, where the colours relate to orange is where more than 60% of the workers are employed in industry and commerce by 1841, which is the first census where we are given an indication of people's occupations. And then where it's yellow, less than 45%. So this is the area we're particularly interested in, and our next map shows in more detail the specialism within just this part of West Yorkshire. So you can see here the white cloth area, so where the cloth was taken before it was dyed to market, whereas these were the mixed cloth areas where there was dyeing going on in these areas too. And here is a picture of the old-fashioned way of getting cloth to market. And in the upland areas where the waterways were tiny, very good for having water mills and for cleaning the wool and so on, but you went to market either carrying it or using a pack horse. And here's a larger scale bridge, and this was the scene of the cloth market until the 1680s. This was the river that was by then still not quite as navigable as people would have liked it to be. But we're going to come on and talk about that in a moment. Now, Leeds was exceedingly annoyed when they heard that Wakefield had made a cloth hall in 1710. And as it was said by Thoresby, this step caused Leeds to bestir itself. And Thoresby and the mayor and others went to ask Irwin at Temple Newsam to support the building of a cloth hall in Leeds. This was granted. They raised £1,000 for its construction, and Bob's your uncle in 1711 the hall opened. Amazing what you can do when your mind is concentrated. But Defoe's description, by the way, still related to the time when the market was on Leeds Bridge. Defoe's description of published in 1724. And then there was a series of cloth halls built. The second one was on the south side of the river. And then the third one, of which there's still this bit remaining at the front and the assembly rooms here, and then the railway cut through it. That's another story. And then because of the railway cutting through, they did provide a fourth one, but that wasn't used for very long before it was redundant. That's where the Met Hotel then stood. And the first white cloth hall is still there. Well, fragments of it are. It has been refurbished, still awaiting a modern occupier. The mixed cloth hall for trading of the dyed woolen cloth was on the other side of town, where City Square now is. And in each of these halls, there was space for many hundreds of people to bring their cloth on market day. And by the 1780s, there were reckoned to be 73 merchant firms in Leeds. That's according to our current historians, Steve Burt and Kevin Grady. And increasingly, the finishing of cloth was being carried out in Leeds, and the merchants were doing this themselves. So they weren't just buying finished cloth and selling, they were buying the cloth in whatever state and then finishing it themselves. Now, the navigation I said I would mention. If you could go by water, you did in the days when the roads were still really bad. And there's a whole story to be told about the improving transport linkages and modes of transport. But the improvement to the natural river air from Leeds down to the Humber estuary was carried out from the turn of the 17th, 18th centuries and made a great deal of difference. And over the 18th century, trade increased by eightfold. By the 1770s, Leeds merchants handled about a third of all the woolen cloth exported from England. And given what an important export that was, Leeds really was a principal export city. Well, a town, sorry. Still a town, of course, until 1893. So here we have the beginnings of explaining about this process of industrialization that followed on from the rapid increase of trade in the 18th century. Why did the system of production change from domestic to industrial? How did the changes happen? Who were the early industrialists here? And there's another whole story to be told about the financial mechanisms, institutions, actors, and so on. But that we don't go into that today. Here's the rather vivid smoke-infested picture created by Joseph Rhodes. And in case you wonder exactly what you're looking at, just see this mill here. That's not actually a woolen mill, but there were many woolen mills that looked like this. That's the Marshall's flax spinning mill. But that was the typical form of mills across West Yorkshire. Now, in 1822, you can see who was who and where they were from Bain's directory. And this heading to the merchants section shows that the ones marked with a star were also stuff merchants, meaning making dealing in wool, and those marked with a cross are the merchants and woolen cloth manufacturers. So it's the transition from just being merchants to being manufacturers. And one of those, Benjamin Gott, was a very early adopter of machinery and had the first really what could be called a manufactory. So he was apprenticed in the old-fashioned way to a merchant, but was left as a junior partner, having experienced the early death of the partners who'd taken him on as an apprentice. So he and another young man decided to go for a bold decision and bought a field and built a mill and invested in steam engines and had 1,000 employees by the turn of the 19th century. And here was the location of their mill, just upstream from the centre of town. Out in the countryside, it would have seemed in those days, on Beaning, a water meadow, and benefiting. Not that this part of the river was properly navigable, and here was a weir that was later covered up by the station, but they certainly benefited very soon from the completion of the Aaron Calder, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. Here's the 1850 map showing Park Mills. This is the Great Mill Yard here. And a series of buildings as he gradually expanded and adopted machinery. There's a view of the building. Here's the Great Mill Yard. These were offices over here in that little building. Then here were engines. And the spinning mules were apparently in that range there. And this is Wellington Street with the waterways behind here. And another view of the great mill yard with these tall brick buildings. And here's one of these game-changing Bolton and Watt engines that were applied to Gott's Mill and to the flax spinning businesses of Leeds and to other woolen mills. And here you can see the amount of change that was happening. Here's the 1815 map. Here's the Fowler map of just 6 years later coming in on top, showing how much development there was. And one of the early adopters of a range of machinery was a chap called Hurst, who had William Hurst, who'd come from Huddersfield, aged only 18 in the mid 1790s. And he went ahead with investing in cropping machinery, despite threats from the machine breakers, so-called Luddites, who had been the croppers. And he knew that the quality was better when you could apply machinery to tasks. And he was an early adopter of nearly all the machinery that came into play between the Napoleonic Wars that finished in 1815 and about 1825. But he then suffered in the trade problems of the mid 1820s. But he encouraged others to adopt as well. One of the long-lived firms, one of the few remaining woolen firms, A.W. Hainsworth, is stunningly to the west of Leeds, started off in the late 18th century, and with the wonderfully named Abimelech Hainsworth, known as Old Bim, who was in business by the age of 14, and in the early 1780s, he was the one taking cloth made by hand in Farsley to sell in Leeds. He saved up enough money to buy 4 acres of land, set up a workshop for hand loom weavers, so that there was a more organised source of supply. And during difficult trading conditions of the Napoleonic Wars, he cannily bought up a nearby ailing water-powered mill with facilities for cloth makers to bring their fleeces to be prepared for a fee. And then after spinning and weaving, the cloth was brought back for the finishing processes at the mill. So you can see, things were going back and forth, and it wasn't all gathered together in one place like Gott was able to do a bit later. And then, by the way, it was a 2-hour walk to the cloth hall to sell the pieces. The original Hainsworth had started the business back in the 1780s. But then the following generations used some of their legacy to invest in 2 steam-powered mill buildings and opened up the potential for vertically integrated manufacture to be in place by the 1860s, with all the process of cloth making carried out by machinery. And so the formerly self-employed clothiers became mill workers. And the Hainsworths, by the way, were early supporters of the Yorkshire College, and subsequent generations trained there. And this is recent photographs taken in their works, and some of these included in Leeds Cradle of Innovation by Steve Burton Me that came out in 2018, with their special cloth that they still produce. And they're just one of a number of mills that were out there on the west side of what's now Leeds, but with the separate settlements of Stanley and Pudsey until the 1970s. And one of the other mills was Sunnybank Mills. The mill building's still there, now used for all sorts of things in the 21st century, including a textile archive and other textile-related and craft-related activities going on there. So now I just want to quickly show you a selection of other parts of town where industrialisation was happening. Here's Holbeck, with mills coming thick and fast. Yes, flax spinning by the Marshall's mill, but also other kinds of activity. And here's the Kirkstall mills and the dyeing activity that was growing up alongside the river there by the middle of the 19th century. The colourful Massa maps. And here's how the mills of West Yorkshire in the middle of the 19th century sit with the overall map of West Yorkshire. And so that then you can see that over time, actually, there was more and more concentration of activity on the coal fields because coal was needed, of course, to drive the steam engines. So while much of the industry had been in the country areas in the pre-industrial period, industry was increasingly coming downhill and into the larger towns and the cities. You can see here population change, and here the out townships compared with the in townships as the town itself expanded. You can see here, so there's more population in the out townships, so that's the boundary of the town, taking in more people who are then counted as urban. Now, changes in Leeds during industrialisation. We've got this huge amount of activity going on, and alongside wool, all sorts of other changes. The scene becoming more and more thickly developed. Here are the potteries south of the river, windmills on the hills beyond. And although a huge amount of success, and we rightly celebrate all that happened here, you have to remember that it was on the back of a great deal of hardship and difficulty for the folk who worked in these industries. And it wasn't until the 1830s that there was any effective legislation, and it took a while for all the pieces to be in place to really improve the lot of the working classes. And children were not, didn't have a right to a free education until much later in the Victorian period. They were still having to work up to 10 hours a day under the Factory Act 1847. So mills were mostly beyond the city centre itself, and in the city centre, increasingly, there was the phenomenon of the warehouse district. So here's the map of 1850, our first Ordnance Survey, and here coming in over the top of it is the 1900 map. It shows the thickening up of the area. And because the railways had come in here, the first station, another one alongside it in the 1860s, and the central station here between those two in time. And so this area, having been supposed to be the smart West End residential area, this became increasingly colonised by what were known as warehouses. So the business-to-business premises of the cloth makers, where they could do their deals and show their wares and do the pressing and packing and quickly get their stuff to the railways. And they dressed themselves up in these fine buildings. There's still quite a lot to see there, and the evidence is there in the physical fabric of the built environment. This is one of the finest buildings, I think, the Stephen Smith warehouse in York Place. Not as well noticed as it should be. It's a narrow street next time you're there, near to the granite-covered Bank of England building and the Met Hotel. Look out for this warehouse on the south side of York Place. This is on the north side of York Place, and here you can see that by the 1870s, the directory referred to not the place names but alone, but the Woolen district. And here it's called the Woolen district, the cloth area. So then the decline from after the First World War, as I mentioned right at the start, and this in red, the series of downward trends, though, there was still a sixth of West Yorkshire workforce in woolens in the middle of the 20th century. overlapping with lifetimes of many people we still know. And in 1950, there were still over 1,000 woolen and worsted mills across West Yorkshire. Extraordinary to think. And there's Hull, the gateway to the mainland Europe. And of course, so much of the later product was also going out the other way via the Leeds and Liverpool Canal to the New World. And this year, when we're celebrating 400 years since the Leeds Charter that was granted by Charles I and that enabled the merchants to come more to the fore and have more independence and have jurisdiction over a larger area, the same as the old parish of Leeds. This just gives you a few examples, amongst many, of the Leeds crest. So these are some of my main sources. There are many more besides, and I hope that it will inspire you to go away and read about this for yourself. You can look back at a talk that was given for the Phil and Lit back in 2022. It's there online on the Phil and Lit website under the talk of that name. You'll have to scroll back through past events to find it or use that link. And I'm Rachael Unsworth. I run Leeds City Walking Tours. It's actually very difficult to do this long yarn as a tour because there's so little actually to see. But I do weave into many tours aspects of the story of woolen cloth, as well as running many other different kinds of tours for a variety of audiences. So I hope to see you before too long. Thank you very much for listening.